I think that there's always a lot of focus on innovation and moving forward and thinking about what's groundbreaking and what's next. And I don't disagree. However, I think what we sometimes tend to lose sight of is a healthy balance with learnings that we already have, right? How do I take past things or past learnings, whether they've gone well or not well, and combine that with forward thinking and innovation? One way to actionably do that, I think, is to have postmortems, like after a campaign has launched or after you've done an event or anything. Really carve out the time to say, okay, what were we measuring against? Did we hit it? Why do we think we didn't hit it? Or even just like postmortems about like, how was the process of actually working on that project? Did it go well? Did we accomplish it? But was everyone crazy by the end of it? Right? And like, it can be learnings about, yes, the work itself, or it can be learnings about the process. But I think one actionable way to be both innovative and forward thinking while not overlooking learnings is just to carve out that time to be reflective and look back and not just put our heads down and move on to the next thing. I think we need to take time to both celebrate the wins, yes, but also learn from how the heck we actually got there.
I guess we'll start with the easy stuff about you. What do you love about your job when it comes to managing creative resources?
I love that there's so much unique talent out there that just like every brief might have its own very particular strategies and needs, you need to build that team to accomplish that. And it kind of feels like compiling your ideal roster every time you get a project brief and saying, okay, what are all the pieces I need to accomplish this? And sometimes that's really fun to put completely wildly different people together too. And that's where sometimes it's really hard at the same time too, right? To find all of those unicorns and put them together and say, how is this going to accomplish what we need to out of the brief?
Yeah, I love that. If you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit more about that thought process of matching the right unicorns to the right brief or the right job, because I know a lot of people say it's kind of intangible in your gut, but I'm sure you have some framework around like how do you match the right people to the right projects?
Yeah. I mean, I I'm a big fan of briefs because, right, that's going to be your measurement for success. So I think if you can start out and say like, okay, what is our end goal? And then work backwards from there and start to say, what are all the steps in the process that get us there? And sometimes that means you might need a different team for each step of the process too, right? Like it might mean, okay, there's some really big thinking that needs to happen here at the front. So therefore, I'm going to put this group of people together. And then when it gets time to like, how do I really tangibly start to bring those big ideas to life visually, tonally, that might be a different group of people, or it might be the same. But I think it's like identifying what your end goal is and then what are all the steps along the way to get there. And that's how you bring in those different people.
Hmm. Do you have, I know you have a lot of experience in creating scalable processes in-house for brands that you've worked on and worked for. What does that brief look like? Do you have sort of a framework that you use each time, or like do you have kind of a brief template in your head that you fill in the blanks? How does that work?
Yeah. So I've worked with like similar processes, I think, in every place I've been, whether it's a smaller nonprofit or a larger company like Stanley Black and Decker. But I'll speak to just right now, the way our process works is we do have a brief template, especially when we're thinking about like our what we call our tier one campaigns, right? And it's a brief that just very clearly identifies, okay, what is the objective we're trying to achieve? How do we know what success looks like? Who is the audience we're talking to, right? Kind of like all of your standards, but then there's some non-standards, like what does the audience currently think and perceive, and what do we want them to think and perceive? So it's got all of these like, hey, if we're using this as our checklist to accomplish, this has all of the things, and that's what grounds every step of our process. Here we start first with making that brief. So it's usually our creative, myself as a creative director and our director of account management with our client. Our internal clients are our brand marketers and our product team. So we build that brief with them, and then we go through a creative strategy phase, and then we go through creative development, and then eventually creative production. So you can see even in like, I mean, as you know from your world, like those are all three very different steps in the process, right? And those just require different groups of thought and the way that people strategize and contribute. So it's often for us three different groups of people in our in-house creative agency that contribute to that.
Very cool. And you mentioned earlier it can be really challenging as well. Like, what are some challenges you run into in this process of managing so many different creative teams, internal, external resources? What are some bumps in the road along the way that maybe we can help people overcome?
Sometimes you get projects that feel like, well, let me back up even further. I think one challenge is always just creating the clarity, right? Creating the clarity of like, what are we trying to accomplish first? But then once you get past that and you get to what you're talking about, like the people part, I think some things that are challenging is that our world is just different. And I know every generation of like creatives and people probably say that, right? But it's like every brief I feel like I've gotten, I'm like, oof, I've never done this before. And it's like, not like I'm fresh and new, I'm by no means 30, 40 years into my career, but I'm by no means, I've seen a lot of projects and I've been in a lot of kickoffs. And sometimes you get a kickoff and you're just like, I've never done this before. And sometimes no one in the room has done that before. And that's a challenge. And like, how do I get all of the right people to help us tackle this? And on the flip side, sometimes everyone in the room has done it before. And that's where it's also a challenge of like, how do I make sure I've got the right people in the room to bring fresh ideas and to make sure that this isn't rinse and repeat? And sometimes that's where supplementing and bringing in people to complement kind of your regular roster, right, is really helpful too. Like we talk about it here as, hey, we've got our roster of key people, and we kind of organize our creatives into pods, if you will, right, who are working on particular clients. But every once in a while, you've got to pull someone from the bench, just like you would in a baseball of like, hey, I've got a DH for a certain team that I play, or a certain pitcher who's there, right? Like you've got to pull in those key players. So it's both when it's like something you haven't done before and something you have done before, if that makes sense.
And is there a difference in how you move that work forward, how you check in and manage that creative talent, depending on whether they're internal, in-house, or somebody that you're, outsourcing to, for example?
Yeah, I think there definitely is. I mean, I think one thing we've noticed with our internal teams, and I'd imagine there's other companies that can speak to this when you own multiple brands, right? Like for us, we own a lot of the market share in terms of tools and outdoor. Sometimes people don't even realize we own everything from, yes, Black & Decker and Stanley on our nameplate, but we own DeWalt and we own Craftsman and we own Cub Cadet and Hustler. And some of these can be like cannibalistic if you're not careful, right? Like I could be working on something for Stanley, but the same audience could theoretically also be shopping for Craftsman, but we own both of those brands. So how do we make sure that we're separating our creative? And when we have our internal talent, we spend a lot of time when we onboard people educating them on the swim lanes, as we like to call them, of those brands, and how we make sure we're setting both Stanley up for success and Craftsman up for success by giving them each, differentiating things in the marketplace. That gets hard when you're pulling in freelance talent who doesn't have all of that background. So I think for us, there is that period of like building a freelance bench that feels like an extension of our team, that we can spend the time and energy and make sure that they have that education of like, hey, here's all of the brands that we own. And even if you're just working on Craftsman, you really have to be aware of everything else, not just our competitors, right? But the brands that we also own. So there is a difference in that we have the luxury of our internal folks that I feel like they kind of know and breathe that every day. And then the external folks, we just have to make sure we're doing our due diligence of making sure that they still have that same background and awareness of our portfolio that internal teammates do.
Yeah. And how What would that dream onboarding look like if if you were able to educate people the same way and on those swim lanes as you mentioned, and like onboard them into the family of brands or the right brand guidelines, like is it something you're already working on doing, or is it something that you can picture? Like what would ideally that onboarding look like for new talent that comes in off the bench, for example?
It's a combination of, I guess I'll say, different learning styles, maybe. Like we've spent a lot of time and effort, probably a solid 2 years when I first joined, building really, really great brand standards and making all of our brand standards follow the same format, as like to the point where like if you pull up the like appendix or the, what's the word I'm looking for? The menu of one brand standard, it's going to look like the order, the sections, everything is the same, so that someone can really easily go back and forth and reference those two. So it's like, one, we have the educational pieces that you need, right, to like get smart on our brands. So that is a dream part of the process, is just having really great tools and resources for your people, whether they're internal or external. But then I think too, part of that ideal onboarding process is facilitating opportunities for them to experience it firsthand. Because it's one thing to just read it and be like, okay, I've seen a couple creative examples, but it's another thing to be like, hey, for the next 2 weeks, every time there's a DeWalt status meeting, our account team's going to be able to pull you in for, like, even if it's just a 30-minute Zoom here and there, seeing it, hearing the conversation, right? Like copywriters is one of the most difficult ones for us. Like designers, it's a little easier in that, like, visually you can be like, cool, I get the difference. I see the font family, I see the textures, I see the colorways, like I can understand that. Copywriters, it's tricky to be like, tonally, how do I really immerse myself in this? How do I understand there's a whole set of adjectives that we give to one brand exclusively, and we actually don't allow this other brand to use because we want to create that differentiation. And that's really hard to get from a brand standard. Like until you're in a creative review and hear someone talking about it, that doesn't always happen. So just the onboarding process of, hey, let's do a deep dive on each of our brands for the next 2 weeks. It's going to be a 30-minute Zoom here and there, is ideal.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I didn't think about how the tone of voice can be so much harder than grasping the visual look and feel of a brand. Switching gears just a little bit in terms of creative direction of all these brands and specifically around budgets, I imagine there's a lot of different talent, different teams working on a lot of different things. How do you avoid things going down the wrong path, dragging out the scope, dragging out the budget, those sort of things? So we often hear like rogue spend is an issue amongst creative resource managers, and like how do you recommend keeping an eye on those sort of things so it doesn't blow out the budget?
Yeah. I mean, I have to give good credit to our account management team. Wears dual hats of like playing resource manager at time too, right? Our account managers and our project managers. And they're frankly just incredibly experienced and smart at being like, I know if I have this level creative, and if they're like, I've worked with this creative before, I can really grasp how long this is truly going to take. So they're really good at scoping. I think that's super important. But I think the other important part is just being really strong communicators. And sometimes being strong communicators also comes from, like, you have to develop that type of relationship with that freelance partner, right? And it's got to be a mutual respect and understanding of like checking in. And then it sounds so elementary, but it's like, hey, we have to check in and let me know how you're doing on hours. Like, just as simple as having that conversation. Yes, having a tool to track it is one thing, but I think going beyond, like, having the tool as your foundation, but then also being able to build that relationship and have conversation about realistic hours and what's going on with the project.
Can you say more about the relationship aspects with your freelancers? Because that's another thing we hear about a lot in terms of like, I wish I didn't have to do all this other admin stuff and the work about work, versus
Yeah.
building the relationship and doing the actual creative work.
Yeah.
Can you share more about how you build relationships with freelancers?
Yeah. I think as much as you can make freelancers not feel like freelancers, is that a thing, right? It's like, again, we keep describing it as this extension of our team. And we like to say here, like, it's not a dirty word for us. It's not like there's an in-house versus out-of-house. These are just really great, unique talents and levers that we get to pull as needed. And building that relationship, like any relationship, whether you're onboarding somebody new to the company, just takes time and effort, and you have to put in that time and effort up front. So, as you're doing that resourcing planning for hours, like making sure that you're planning for, hey, I want this person in a part of the kickoffs. I want them in all of these reviews. I want them pitching work. We let our freelancers pitch work. Like, it's not a, hey, they do the work and then we take it away internally and pitch it. We're really transparent to our clients in-house. Like, hey, I have a great connection that I previously worked with and we want to bring them into this project, to the point now where they've asked us, like, hey, this is different. Do you have anyone in mind who's done something like this before? And I think they appreciate that we're being really thoughtful about doing what's best for the project and the company, and making sure that we're rounding out our team accordingly.
Yeah, I love that. Not to put you on the spot, but what's your number one piece of advice around managing a large creative workforce, or setting up for scale in terms of your creative output?
My number one piece of advice is to just be really aware of what capabilities and talents you do have and what you don't, and that's okay. And being really curious about finding the pieces that you don't currently do well and owning up to that and admitting it. It's so rare that you have every single role that you need perfectly staffed with the level of talent that you need, right? Like, that is an anomaly. It's especially in-house, right? And we've even seen it and experienced it at agencies, right? It's why you're constantly staffing up and down according to clients. So I think if you can do a good job of holding yourself accountable to constant check-ins to say, hey, what am I working with? What do I need? And always being prepared to quickly supplement things in to round it out according to the project need. That kind of awareness and agility will really be helpful.
Perfectly said. I love that. One last
Helpful
question.
I feel like I'm speaking a little bit broad. I can try and give more specifics, but hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, I mean that's great. I mean, if you have a specific example in mind in recent work, that always helps.
Yeah, I mean, I think I always go back to, I'll just give another example with copywriting, right? And I think it's evident with design too, right? Like, if you have a really cool idea that comes to life and it's an illustration style and you're just like, we don't have an illustrator in house, right? Like, seems like a really quick get to be like, okay, I need to supplement with this type of illustration. But it happens with our copy teams all the time too. And I think we're trying to always educate both our teams and our people, our creatives, that, like, it's okay if you don't write humor and lyrical rhymes for headlines, right? Like, we just had a scenario where we just released a huge campaign for Craftsman and we partnered with a really great agency. And it was like, who did they have in-house writing these jingles? And it's like, yeah, our copywriters aren't jingle writers, right? Because, like, that is a craft and a skill that someone has honed in over time. And we just had to be really honest with ourselves as we transitioned some of that work and we're doing it in-house, to say, what do we need to do to either upskill or be transparent that, like, this is an area in which we need help, especially when it's like a niche thing, right? That it's like, okay, this isn't going to happen across all of our brands. It's not going to fill 80% of someone's time. How do we, like, supplement with somebody to really help us do this well?
Yeah, I love that. The jingle writers are
Yeah.
jingle.
Our copywriters were like, well, I've done a lot of things, but I've never done this.
One last question before we wrap that I'm asking everybody, and you can take this any direction you want, but we're just very aware of the state of work, and we talk a lot about the future of work. And so just curious your thoughts around what does the future of work mean to you?
Wow, that's a big question, Zach. Like, that makes sense as an ending one.
Like, what are you seeing that you feel is going to be really important in the workforce?
I think everyone tends to focus on, I shouldn't say everyone. I think that there's always a lot of focus on innovation and moving forward and thinking about what's groundbreaking and what's next. And I don't disagree. I think that's super important. However, I think it's what we sometimes tend to lose sight of is the healthy balance with learnings that we already have, right? And it's like, how do I take past things or past learnings, whether they've gone well or not well, and combine that with forward thinking and innovation? And I think that's kind of a sweet spot that sometimes we innovate for the sake of innovating without even having a purpose for it yet. And it's like, how do we constantly balance where we've been and how we build on it with being forward thinking?
Yeah, I like that. What are some methods of some actionable ways that you'd be able to do that?
Yeah, I think it's really hard to do when our world is moving so fast. But like one way to actionably do that, I think, is to have postmortems. So, right, like after a campaign has launched or after you've done an event or anything, to like really carve out the time to say, okay, what were we measuring against? Did we hit it? Why do we think we didn't hit it? Or even just like postmortems about like, how was the process of actually working on that project? Did it go well? Did we accomplish it? But was everyone crazy by the end of it? Right? And like it can be learnings about, yes, the work itself, or it can be learnings about the process. But I think one actionable way to be both innovative and forward thinking while not overlooking learnings is just to carve out that time to be reflective and look back and not just put our heads down and move on to the next thing. I think we need to take time to both celebrate the wins, yes, but also learn from how the heck we actually got there.